It's wonderful but not surprising to see such a great turnout for this event. I welcome you to today's very special History Speaker Series event with our three distinguished guests. Before we begin, let me just touch on two housekeeping matters. This presentation is being recorded, so if you could remove badges. And also, please make sure you turn off your phones or put them on mute. Now to our panelists. An hour event will not do justice to the collective brain power we have assembled here, so I shall keep my introductions very brief. So first, seated in the front is the current director of the Office of Net Assessment, James Baker, and he will provide us with a few remarks about the legacy of Andrew Marshall. Mr. Baker is responsible for providing the Secretary of Defense and other senior leaders with independent assessments of the prospects of U.S. military capabilities relative to other actors, as well as the political, economic, and regional implications of those assessments. Continuing in the tradition of Andy Marshall, Mr. Baker's Office of Net Assessment provides a source of deep, long-term future thinking for the Department of Defense. Mr. Baker is well positioned to lead this endeavor. He previously served as a strategist and director of elite thinking teams for the 17th and 18th Chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is a distinguished graduate of the National War College and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He holds four graduate degrees, 2 in engineering disciplines and 2 in security studies from military institutions. On the stage are the two authors of The Last Warrior. As they point out in the conclusion of their own book, Andy Marshall believed, quote, "I think my major achievement is the training or impact I've had on the people who have come through this office," unquote. Well, Dr. Andrew Krepinevich and Mr. Barry Watts are testimony to that legacy. Dr. Krepinevich worked with Andy Marshall and also served on the personal staff of 3 Secretaries of Defense. He has also served as a member of the National Defense Panel, the Defense Science Board Task Force on Joint Experimentation, and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates Policy Board. After a 21-year career in the U.S. Army, he became president of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in 1993. Dr. Krepinevich holds a PhD from Harvard University and has taught on the faculties of West Point, George Mason University, Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, and Georgetown University. His list of publications is far too extensive for me to read here, but his next book, entitled War Like No Other, has a tentative release date of 2017. Our third speaker and the co-author of today's featured book is Barry Watts. Mr. Watts was a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, CSBA, from 2002 until retiring in 2013. From 2006 to 2010, he taught a course on net assessment in Georgetown University's Strategic Studies program. Prior to joining CSBA, Mr. Watts headed the Office of Program Analysis and Evaluation at the Defense Department. During his Air Force career, Mr. Watts flew a combat tour in Vietnam in F-4s, taught logic and philosophy at the U.S. Air Force Academy, served 2 tours in the Office of Net Assessment, and headed the Red Team in the Air Staff's Project Checkmate. Mr. Watts has also written widely on a variety of military topics, including a number of CSBA monographs, and other works include Clausewitzian Friction and Future War, and the Effects and Effectiveness volume of the Gulf War Air Power Survey. Today, we will be the beneficiaries of the fresh insights of these 3 brilliant men, who, like the Pentagon legend Andy Marshall, are in their own right giants in the field of net assessment. With that, Mr. Baker, I turn the podium to you.
Good afternoon. Aaron, thanks very much for your staff and your support, not just creating this event, which is terrific, but the entire History Speakers series, which I think's sort of one of the penultimate things that you can do in the Pentagon is take advantage of those kinds of opportunities. I also want to thank the two very distinguished guests that we have here for writing the biography of one of the most notable American minds of the last 50 years, and for participating with him in that journey. I think this is a remarkable book about a remarkable man. It's full of anecdotes and quips. It gives you a sense of what it is to actually do net assessment. I think even more importantly, it gives a very good sense of who Andy Marshall is, as well as, I think, dispelling some of the myths that have grown up about him, myths that are good and myths that are bad. The book usefully lays bare the magic of what Andy Marshall did. And like all good behind-the-scenes looks at magic, you grow more fascinated with understanding the process by which it was created. I think the book has many things to recommend it. I particularly enjoyed the chapter on the birth of net assessment, and I think that's chapter 3, as well as the early attempts to strangle it in its crib. I also enjoyed the concluding chapter, which I think is a masterful summary in just a few pages of the major strands of Andy Marshall's intellectual thought. And it also includes the deep seriousness with which he undertook his work. Now, I just have 3 reflections, perhaps, to offer upon my reading, and I would invite our distinguished guest to challenge or to confirm these reflections, perhaps, in their comments. First, one of the most remarkable things about this book is it documents the intellectual courage and the individual acts of intellectual courage that were required over a sustained period. The military ethos rightly celebrates physical acts of courage, and it celebrates operational daring. But to be frank, boldness in strategic thinking is not as celebrated, oftentimes because it is contested immediately in the moment, since it challenges our conventional thinking. And also, it goes unrecognized often for years or sometimes for decades. But Marshall, with help, was willing and able to follow his instincts. And I would judge, and I think the book strongly suggests this, that it was never imprudent or an unserious act. It was never a flavor of the month. It was slow, steady, patient, persistent questioning of the fundamentals, oftentimes in the face of doubt. Second, what shines throughout, I think, is Marshall's personal humility, and that sense of humbleness, both in the way that he carried himself and the way he treated others and the way he treated even his own ideas. He accepted that he might be wrong. Conclusions were always tentative, always subject to revision. Third, what many people most often remark upon is Marshall's age and his longevity in his position. I want to reinterpret that as stamina. It takes a remarkable person to serve in senior positions for years on end. It takes a certain stubbornness, and it also takes a sense of duty to get up every day, to trudge into the Pentagon, to often face the supine, the ignorant, the ambitious, the busybodies, the courtiers, and just simply try to tackle the hardest problems of the country and to serve the Secretary of Defense for more than 40 years. Stamina. My goodness. Bold thinking, humility in word and action, and untiring commitment to better our national security. That's the lesson for me of this man, and it's the lesson of this book. Now, 2 brief words about our distinguished guests. First, as you heard, And as many of you know, Andy Krepinevich has been making serious and sustained contributions since at least 1992 to our national security, offering his famed and sought-after judgments on all matters strategic. Sir, we all benefit from your thinking, your teaching, and your work on topics that range the gamut, and frankly, I look forward to many more years of it. And Barry Watts. Let me just say that the Office of Net Assessment loves paper. If you come visit us, you'll see we have stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks. And I've spent some time trying to begin to read through that work. And frankly, Barry, it feels like every other report I come upon has your name on it. I enjoy your writing, sir, and there is much of it to enjoy. Gentlemen, I want to say how grateful I am for you taking the time to write this book about an extraordinary man and his intellectual legacy, and also to say thanks to both of you, as well as to the other members of the ONA alum here, for being part of creating that intellectual body of work, and for taking the time to document it so that we all can benefit by it. Thank you very much.
Generous introductions. I would have to say, speaking for Barry and myself, they're the best we've heard since our host took ill at the last minute at one of our presentations, and they let us introduce ourselves. Also want to congratulate Jim on his taking the position of Director of Net Assessment. Jim and I met really for the first time some months ago, and just incredibly impressive intellect. And he certainly, both intellectually, spiritually, sense of duty, fits the description of the kind of person you'd want to head that office. I understand the only snag, Jim, was when you found out that the director's traditional term of office was 40 years, and you didn't know if you could commit to that that length of service. But we're glad you're there. Our presentation is in three parts. I'm going to provide a bit of an overview of the book, and then we're going to do two vignettes. Barry's going to talk about something that was known as the investment balance in that assessment, which turned out to be, I think, one of the key strategic issues of strategic importance in the 1970s. And then I'll talk a little bit about the so-called revolution in military affairs that came out of the office. The biography, if you're reading it, is very much an intellectual biography. That was one of the, I think, conditions that Andy Marshall set down before he would sit down and subject himself to interviews with us. But just to give you some sense of the man, I think Jim captured it very well. First, a great deal of humility. I remember when I finished my tour in his office in 1993, thanking him so much for all he had taught me. And he said, I never really thought anything I did intellectually was all that special. And I said, I suppose, after Newton figured out gravity, people said, oh, it's not that special. But a lot of what he did was. Second, you have to understand that Marshall is a person who, as Tom Brokaw said, is part of the greatest generation. And the people who lived through that generation growing up, Marshall, born in 1921, so he lives through the Depression. He lives through a time when his father is having a hard time finding work. He lives through World War II. One of the most moving interviews we had with him was when he described his high school graduation in 1939. And there was this sense that war was coming again. And there was this image of the Western Front and the trenches and the slaughter, the incalculable human slaughter. And he said the ROTC cadets were sitting down in the audience and the parents were sitting around the edge. And he said there were people weeping at this supposed celebration of the completion of their scholastic careers. And just a sense of how what kind of environment he grew up in. Second, an incredibly intelligent individual. I don't know how many times I went out of his office feeling like the stupidest guy in the Pentagon. Here's a guy who, at the tender age of, I don't know what, 10, 11, 12, goes to his aunt's house and finds out she has a copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica and just wants to sit down and read the encyclopedia and starts saving up his nickels and dimes so he can buy a set. Way ahead of the curve intellectually. And kind of a Pug Henry, if you remember Herman Wouk's book, Pug Henry, who just seems to be, run into all these key people over the course of World War II. Marshall didn't do it then, but at his high school, the celebrity teacher was Charles Lindbergh's brother. After the war, he is admitted to the University of Chicago. He doesn't have a bachelor's degree, but they admit him to the master's program. Ends up playing bridge with a guy named Kenneth Arrow, who goes on to win the Nobel Prize in economics. He works in a metal shop because in high school that's what he did a lot of. One day somebody came in, Enrico Fermi needs help with his cyclotron, so Marshall goes trudging off to help them. Herman Kahn, he and Herman in the early 1950s are doing work on the H-bomb. Marshall is one of the few people who you can talk to who's actually seen a nuclear explosion up close and personal. And he has some remarkable impressions about that kind of experience. And then on to make friends with a series of senior defense officials, and then academics ranging from the great Sam Huntington to people like Clay Christensen and Joe Bauer at the Harvard Business School, to Richard Rumelt, who's one of the, I think, top strategic thinkers in the private sector. But also, as Aaron said, his mentorship, I think that's what he was most proud of. And Roberta Wohlstetter writes this book, Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision. If you read the acknowledgments, Andy Marshall is the one who suggested that to her. It's all about intelligence failure and how this rush of information can actually counteract other information coming in, other intelligence. And so if you know the right information, you are in good shape. But it's how do you separate the wheat from the chaff? And anyway, Wohlstetter ends up with this phenomenal book that's read down to this day. She wins the Medal of Freedom. And I asked Andy, I said, how did you receive her book? He said, well, I had done work in the early 50s over in NATO, and I kind of figured this out, but I thought it needed to get public exposure. So again, a sense of the man's humility and modesty. Graham Allison, when I was a cadet at West Point, there was this fantastic new book, Essence of Decision. And it described how, essentially, when you looked at your rivals, your competitors, you couldn't assume that they would act rationally, that organizations played a big role, bureaucrats played a big role. There was no single unitary actor. Read Allison's forward. A lot of that comes from Andy Marshall. In fact, in the late 1950s, when Marshall had access to basically very high clearances, he knew because of the U-2 flights where the Soviets were positioning their bomber bases. At the same time, his colleagues at RAND, who didn't have that sort of security clearance, were assuming that the Russians would be putting their bomber bases in an optimum location, which essentially was along the area of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, deep in the interior, where NATO bombers would have, or U.S. bombers would have a hard time reaching it, and also along near the railroad. So again, you get supplies and logistics and so on. In fact, Marshall knew that they were placing them along the border, along the periphery, where their organization, their Air Force, had initially put their air bases, because in the early days of aviation, the ranges weren't that great. So if you wanted to go out to sea and protect your borders, you need to put your base near the ocean. He's trying to tell these guys and gals at RAND, you might want to think about this. No. This is the optimal place. This is where they're going to put their bases. And that really is part of the incubation period that leads to his work with people at Harvard like May and Neustadt that convinces Graham Allison, who's a young grad student acting as a rapporteur for these meetings, that this is the book he needs to write. And then finally, I guess two things very quickly. One is in 1966, William Kaufman, who some of you, if you're around my age, might know. Kaufman is an MIT professor who also was writing the posture statement for secretaries of defense, starting with McNamara all the way up through Harold Brown. And Kaufman asked Marshall to come to a meeting of the American Political Science Association and talk about estimating military power. And Marshall writes a fairly short paper, but I think it's one of the best papers you can read in terms of the challenges of really accurately estimating how you're doing in a military competition. And essentially he says you need to go well beyond the numbers of planes, tanks, ships, guns, the little silhouette figures that you see in little bar graphs. He said it's that and so much more. And he begins really to get into how are these people planning to fight? What are the contingencies we're looking at? Are we looking at today? Are we looking out 10, 15, 20 years? What are the critical competitions that we have to be good at? And so he begins to look in the NATO context of armor, anti-armor operations, which are so critical because of the heavy tank forces and so on. And then by 1972-73, he's developed a net assessment methodology that he refuses to define. He refuses to tell any of his military assistants what it is. And so there's an enormous amount of frustration. People like Barry and I, you go into his office with an idea, you come out maybe more confused than you were when you went in. But it's really almost an individual effort of discovery. But the characteristics of that assessment are that it's diagnostic. I think one of the reasons Marshall lasts so long is that he really isn't prescriptive. But if you use a medical analogy, if you have a good doctor who's a terrific diagnostician, that helps whoever's going to write the prescription to write the best one. You get the diagnosis wrong. If you have liver disease and somebody says you have heart disease, you may get a great prescription for heart disease, but the problem's in the liver. So it's what is the character of the competition is absolutely critical. It's multidisciplinary. Marshall has guys like Murray Feshbach at Georgetown comes in, and he's doing studies on, this is during the Cold War, on Russian demographics, Soviet demographics. The Russian population is becoming a smaller and smaller percentage. They're going to have language problems. They're going to have command and control problems. We need to look at that. Also in terms of health issues over there, the decline of life expectancy, the growing social cost of keeping the Soviet people in some kind of a decent shape is taking money away from things they can be doing to compete more effectively with us. So multidisciplinary. Looking for discontinuities. This is huge. If the competition stays the same today, tomorrow, 5 years, 10 years, Secretary of Defense probably has a pretty good handle on things. What he or she really wants to know is, could there be a major shift in the character of the competition? That's really what you'd like to know. The canary in the mine shaft. This is the next big thing that's likely to come along. How do we begin to anticipate that and react to it now so we're not reacting to it when it does come? And then the issue of cost imposition. Caspar Weinberger, who came in and writing on the surfing the wave of the Reagan defense buildup, really used net assessment less than most defense secretaries, in part because he was faced with a lot fewer difficult choices than Marshall was faced. I was working for Weinberger at the time. We had to figure out how to use all the money that was coming in from Congress. So imagine that. But anyway, when the buildup stops in the middle 80s, Weinberger found a real affection for Marshall. And it was this issue of competitive strategies, which is not just how do we react to what our adversaries are doing, but what is it we can do that costs this much, that can impose this much costs on our rivals and enemies. And I think that's something that we've kind of lost track of over the last 20 years, but it's something that's been kept alive in the Office of Net Assessment. So that's kind of a quick and dirty overview of sort of Marshall and some of the intellectual development he had, some of his contributions. What I'd like to do now is turn things over to my colleague, Barry Watts. I once asked Andy Marshall, I said, of all the people that have worked for you, I think Barry's the closest to you intellectually. And he looked at me and said, yeah, I think you're right. So very disappointed in Marshall's answer. But very glad to have a colleague like Barry Watts as a co-author of this book. So, Barry?
And I wish, Andrew, that you'd forgotten that story, but what the heck.
Another humility.
Okay, I'm going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes talking about the burden that Soviet military programs imposed on the USSR's economy during the Cold War, particularly during the 70s and 80s. Now, that may strike many of you as a rather arcane relic left over from the Cold War, and you might plausibly wonder why I decided to talk about this. And the short answer is because the history of the disagreement between CIA and the Office of Net Assessment over what the actual burden of Soviet military programs was illustrates, at least for me, the importance of judgment in doing diagnostic net assessment. Judgment in the sense of being able to focus over time as you work on a particular competition or balance on what's really important as opposed to the many things that are of lesser importance or irrelevant. So with that as the other aspect of this is persistence. This is a subject that was debated within the office and with CIA, as I said, during the 70s and 80s, but as you'll see, Andy's focus and interest in this and willing to reevaluate the judgments that he developed early on about the burden rate and what it really was and what it meant persisted well past the end of the Cold War to the early 2000s, as it turns out. Now let me see if I can.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, I found the right button. What was the burden of the USSR's economic programs? What was the burden rate? And basically, it's just a ratio. What you wanted was the ruble costs of all the Soviet military programs divided by, again in rubles, the Soviets' gross national product in those days before we got to GDP today. The problem that emerged right at the outset with this was, gee whiz, we just didn't have detailed ruble costs of what the Soviets were spending on military programs. In fact, we didn't even really have accurate estimates going back to the early 70s or even before of what Soviet GDP was. So the first thing that happened over at CIA was an attempt to do dollar costing of Soviet military programs. And what I would emphasize here is they were busily doing dollar costing of what they could see. And I mean see in the sense of there were things like ICBM silos and long-range bomber bases and division equipment sets laid out in careful rows in the middle of the Soviet Union. Those sorts of things you could easily find and count over time using satellite reconnaissance. As you'll see, there were a lot of other things. For example, the cost of the Soviet Empire, maintaining the East Europeans and the Cubans and so on and so forth, which, while a part of the defense burden, wasn't nearly as visible to the people who were doing the dollar cost estimates over at CIA. Now, with respect to the numerator part, if you look at that chart, you'll see that in the late 60s, in fact, they were starting to catch up with this in aggregate spending. In other words, if you got dollar cost estimates of Soviet military programs from CIA, you could compare those directly with the US defense budgets and see who was spending more or whose spending was going to grow in the future. And if you scroll forward to, say, 1973 or so, when our burden rate, according to Pentagon documents, was about 5.7%, you'll see that they were already outspending us by 20 to 30 billion. These are in 1978 constant dollars, so, you know, much older money. And it looked like they were going to continue outspending us for a fair amount of time into the future. Now, what about the denominator? Yeah, again, it would have been nice to have had good, accurate Soviet data. As we'll see, in the late 80s, the Soviet economists themselves started explaining that there had been a lot of fudging and fiddling with their numbers. They really don't turn out to have been reliable. So what CIA did with respect to the dollar cost estimating was just simply assume that the size of the Soviet economy was about 50 to 55% of the US economy. That turned out to be a gross error, by about a factor of 2, but that was, in fact, how we, in the 70s, started calculating the burden rate. Now, we get to the heart, this brings us really to the heart of the controversy. If their economy is half the size of ours, and they're spending in absolute terms at least what we're spending or not more, and our burden rate is about 5.6%, then the 6 to 7% that CIA and DIA signed up to in the early 70s shouldn't have been right. I mean, simple arithmetic says their burden rate should have been double. And in fact, Andy's estimates during that period was it was between 10 and 20%. And you can see some of the later estimates of the defense burden with Andy's 20 to 30% in the late 80s versus 15 to 17, which was as high as the CIA people ever got up to by Cold War's end. And of course, if the Soviet economy was, say, 20 or 25% of the US economy instead of 50 to 55%, then the burden rate would have been even higher. The first point I want to make about this is Andy's thinking about this issue did not end with the end of the Cold War. In 2001, he had an opportunity to talk to a former Soviet Colonel Shlikov in Paris, as it turned out, who'd been on the Soviet General Staff and had been involved in economic issues. And he revealed that the Soviets, having contemplated the arsenal of democracy during World War II, the enormous amount of production the US economy was able to provide for military purposes. So they decided that they needed to buy a lot of extra stuff and squirrel it around the Soviet Union. And that was stuff, all this extra equipment that they had hidden was not something you saw readily on overhead reconnaissance. So that was something we were completely blind to. And that's why probably it was closer to 40% towards the end of the Cold War, as opposed to even 30 when you added all that in. The cost of empire, the indirect costs of things like making sure that Aeroflot airplanes could haul military equipment should war come. So that's what Andy got to. Now, what I want to do is basically give you a sense of the implications that he drew from this particular thing. In the 70s, the initial thought in worrying about the burden and suspecting, as he and Jim Schlesinger did, that the burden rate was higher than CIA was telling us, was that perhaps we were pricing ourselves out of the competition. And the reasons for that are fairly straightforward. I flew F-4s in Southeast Asia. Those airplanes cost about $4 million a copy back in those days, in those dollars. A MiG-21, which wasn't quite as capable and certainly wasn't as technically sophisticated as an F-4, only cost about $1 million. Schlesinger pointed out in one of his posture statements that we were having trouble just buying about 800 tanks a year, main battle tanks. Soviets were pushing past 2,000 during that period. So it really did look at that point in time in the early 70s like because of the added cost of our weaponry and the way we chose to procure, we were actually pricing ourselves out of the competition. In talking to Andy about that in the 80s, he admitted, well, that was perhaps not quite the case, but that's what it looked like at the time. If you go to the late 80s, when some of the Soviet economists started revealing that the Soviet economy was probably a lot smaller than CIA had estimated, that led Andy to start talking in terms of the Soviet economy having stopped growing and looking towards the end of the decade was perhaps headed for bankruptcy. Chapter 11 was the term Andy always used in the discussions I had with him in the late 80s about this particular topic. Here I should be very clear. This did not lead Andy Marshall to predict the demise of the Soviet Union. He would be the last to say that he had any sense of when it might unravel, when the Cold War might be won, or the speed and the relatively bloodless way in which that occurred. Just last month, I had an opportunity to sit down with Andy and go through this issue one more time, the whole issue of the Soviet defense burden. And he, quite frankly, just surprised me by blurting out what's on the bottom of that slide. The Soviets were far more capital intensive than we realized, even during the Cold War, due to the low quality of their people. And that's what led him to suggest that the Soviet defense burden, historically, at least when you look back on it in retrospect, was a much more significant criteria for thinking about the long-term competition between the two Cold War adversaries than perhaps anything else. I mean, I can tell you when I was working on the NATO pact balance in the office in the mid-'80s, and it had been sort of standard net assessment practice up to that point, you would always start by adding up all what we called the beams, the numbers of tanks and planes and ICBMs and naval combatants and so on and so forth that both sides had, and start comparing those. But Andy's bottom line in looking back at 2015 at this as a criterion issue in articulating what was really important in that assessment, you know, he really came to the conclusion that this particular criterion was perhaps the most important that we should have focused on in doing the net assessments that were done in the office right through the end of the Cold War. That's about all I have to say. The one other thing that's worth emphasizing here is if you look back at this history, Andy was persistent. He never closed the book on the whole issue of the Soviet defense burden and the controversy with CIA. And he was always willing over time, as Jim said, to revise his judgments, which you can see he did in very fundamental ways. And that kind of persistence and ability to continue looking for new evidence to adjust your judgments and the conclusions you draw about a competition were really a significant feature of the way Andy approached net assessment. And I think my colleague here, Andrew, will reiterate that same point in looking at the revolution in military affairs. I mean, I did a whole series of studies over a period of a decade on this particular topic. And every year or two, Andy would come back and say, you ought to look at it again. And I think, why on earth? I thought we put that one to bed way back when. But his urging to go back and look at it again always brought fresh insights that were important. Andrew?
Thanks, Barry. I'll note that one of the people who was integral to that assessment, David Epstein, is in the audience today, and David did a lot of terrific work on that. I also have to admit, quite frankly, I thought this was a really boring balance. I didn't even bother to think about it, never read it. And in doing the research on the book, you get to this point in the early 1970s where you have Kissinger on the one side and Schlesinger and Marshall on the other. And Kissinger saying, look, we have to pull in our horns, or we have to cut these deals with the Soviets, arms control and so on, partly because the American people just don't have the stomach, Vietnam's going on, to push this. But the other thing Kissinger is looking at, and this is Schlesinger goes over to CIA and Marshall would visit him on Saturdays. It's if CIA is right, and they're spending 6% of their economy, which is half of ours, and we're spending 6% of our economy, which is twice theirs, and we're producing a few hundred tanks a year, and they're producing 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. Even though our tanks are better, they're not 10 or 15 times better. These people are much more efficient than we are, according to what the CIA is telling us. Time is not on our side. We're losing this competition. And basically, Schlesinger, I mean, if their thoughts could, be expressed in words, the air would have turned blue. Schlesinger saying this is a bunch of BS. We've got to take a better look at this. And Marshall takes that on and begins to challenge CIA. And Schlesinger gets to the point where he says, I don't believe this stuff. I'm a revivalist, he could go around telling people. I believe that this is wrong, that time is not on their side, it's on our side. And that's a fundamental issue when you're crafting a strategy. Whose side is time on? So again, I just regretted I hadn't read that earlier. my own work in the office had a lot to do with the so-called revolution in military affairs, and it was pretty big stuff in the 1990s, and transformation was pretty big. And I thought I was doing some pretty path-breaking work. And then in reading and researching for the book, come upon a memo. Marshall is serving on this Commission on Integrated Long-Term Strategy. The Commission's meeting in 1987, so we're negotiating the INF Treaty. We're worried about Russian operational maneuver groups and NATO and all these things they could do. It's Cold War is cold, okay? And it's nasty. And Marshall writes this memo to Freddie Clay, who's the Undersecretary for Policy, saying, look, our Commission's supposed to be looking 10 to 20 years out. So the two big problems 10 to 20 years out are the rise of China and precision warfare. I almost fell off my chair. I mean, 1987, thinking about these sorts of things. It took the world about, 10 or 15 years to catch up with where Marshall was thinking in that time period. The issue that Marshall posed was a lot of the Soviets at that time were writing about what they call reconnaissance strike complexes. We would call them battle networks and precision strike capabilities. And they said, this is the next big thing in warfare. And so Marshall's guidance to me was, we don't know if these guys are right or if they're not right, okay? If they're right, then, and we believe they're right, then we have an enormous amount of innovation to undertake because warfare is going to be very different. Precision, battle networks, information warfare, all this stuff. If they're wrong, we need to think about two other things. We believe they're wrong. Number one is we need to hedge against the prospect that we're wrong and they're right. And the other is we need to think about if we're trying to deter these guys, they're thinking very differently about what matters and what counts in terms of military power. They're using a wholly different set of metrics and ways of thinking about advantage. So how do we deter them even if we think they're wrong? And then we also have to be able to fight them if somehow deterrence fails. So this is a very challenging and complicated problem. And Marshall's point to the incoming Clinton administration, Secretary Aspen, Secretary Perry, and so on, was the big challenge here, and this really presages the third offset strategy in my mind. The big challenge here is going to be that, well, I guess two big challenges. One is we've got an enormous lead right now. So how do we keep people from acquiring these kinds of capabilities? What can we do to delay? We called it dissuasion strategies. And the second is when this regime becomes mature, which is anti-access area denial, information warfare, and so on, which is what we're seeing now. How is the other side going to compete? And the two, in my estimation, I haven't talked to Marshall about it, but it seems to me that the example isn't the 1950s, where we decide to rely on a wasting asset to extend our ability to build up our economic base, or the 1970s and 80s, where the second offset relies heavily on information technologies, an area where the Soviets couldn't compete. This is more like the 1920s and 30s, where you have a number of major powers. They all have access to this technology, which is now pretty much, if you talk about robotics and so on, in the commercial sector, and big data and so on, directed energy. And the critical discriminators become who figures out how to leverage this stuff the best? Who figures out blitzkrieg before anybody else? Who figures out the fast carrier task force? Who figures out modern amphibious operations and so on? Strategic aerial bombardment. What are those big competitions that are going to define success or failure in war? And that's what Marshall keeps pushing. And there was one meeting when Bob Work was at CSBA, and Bob and I are talking to Mr. Marshall. I don't know if you were there. And it's, well, we figured this out. It's battle networks, it's precision strike. And Marshall said, no, you don't get it. The regime is not mature until the other guy gets it. And then you figure out how you're going to operate in what today we call non-permissive environments. And so again, I guess the other thing that came out of the assessments then was something called the street fighter state. And it was, we have this big advantage, how will others compete? And if you read the street fighter state section, it really describes a lot of what the Iranians have been doing for the last 20, 25 years. So again, how much, was Andrew Marshall's name mentioned in all of this? Maybe here or there a bit, but he was the underlying force behind anti-access area denial, information warfare, air-sea battle, and so on. And it's the value of that office and intellectuals like Jim Baker, who really can help frame and set and inform the debate. Again, that aspect of diagnosis. Final thing I'll say is that the Andy Marshall story, as much as we would like to think we did a good job in telling it, you've only got, in some respects, the tip of the iceberg, because so much of what he did in that office remains classified. And so the full story probably won't be out until Jim Baker, about 40 years is now, is ready to step down as head of the office. With that, I'll close our remarks and be glad to try and respond to any questions you might have. All right, we intimidated them.
Thanks for a great talk. I'm very interested in proud profit. You discussed it in the book for a while, but can you add anything to it or comment more on its impact and importance?
Proud Prophet 83 was a war game that was held during the 2-week period over at NDU, National Defense University. I was on the red team. I was basically the red air guy. I can remember about day 2, I and my fellow red guys were looking at the situation that the game had presented and decided that we weren't going to go to war. And we came into work the next morning and discovered from the control team that we had decided, in fact, to go to war. So it was a very frustrating game from the standpoint of just me as a participant in it. And eventually the thing, leaked off into nuclear use and large-scale nuclear exchanges. What I didn't know at the time, and we did mention this in the book, was that behind the scenes, the chairman and the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, were playing the game, and their goal was to evaluate our nuclear strategy. And basically, the conclusions that they took away from the game was our nuclear strategy was not very workable. In fact, it was really wanting. And it led to specific things like trying to decrease the enthusiasm of some parts of the Pentagon and the services for things like horizontal escalation, because it became apparent in the game that the Navy going out in the Far East and doing a little horizontal escalation was likely to lead to a nuclear exchange. Now, the backstory on that particular episode was that Secretary Weinberger and the chairman basically swore the small number of people at NDU and SCDC at the time, who actually knew what was going on, what the real game being played was, to not mention that for 25 years. And in fact, it was not until 2008 at a conference on net assessment that CSBA held that Phil Carber, who has been one of the participants in SCDC, finally said the 25 years are up, and let me tell you what was really going on. I mean, you felt like a buffoon, because I went through the entire 2 weeks of the game and had no clue. Nor, I think, did very many of the 200 or so other participants in the game. It was just a small inner circle under the SCDC organization over at NDU.
Jim Baker had a question about intellectual courage, and each of the chapters in the book has a quote from Marshall, one of which he said fairly early on, which really resonated, I think, throughout his tenure. And his statement was, "We're here to inform, not to please." And if it was worth his time and his effort to leave Rand, to leave California, where his wife Mary really wanted to live, and come back to Washington, then by golly, he was going to be a straight shooter on these things. And typically, where he ran into trouble was with Secretary of Defense like Weinberger, who just really didn't seem to value what Marshall was doing. Although he and Marshall later became pretty close, but in the 1980s, when Weinberger was there, that was not the case. Marshall's one of the kindest, gentlest people you'll ever want to meet, which is why when Weinberger left, there was an incident that caused a lot of jaws to drop. And at the time, the portraits of former defense secretaries were in the A-ring outside the Office of Net Assessment, 3A 930, or I think that's right. And after Weinberger had left, after I guess the portrait was finished, they were going to have the ceremony, and of course the portrait is shrouded, and they're going to pull the shroud down, and nice words and so on. They had the chair set up and a little food on the side. And we knew that Marshall had been invited, and yet it wasn't on his calendar to go to that ceremony honoring Caspar Weinberger. And so on the morning, we're out in the outer office, and Marshall is there, and he didn't have his go-to-a-ceremony suit on. It was more or less the standard, workaday suit. And one of my colleagues summoned up the courage to ask him, "Sir, are you going to the Weinberger ceremony?" And he responded, "I might go if they were hanging Weinberger instead of his picture." So, are there any other questions? In the back? Yes, ma'am. That's a question for Jim Baker, isn't it? Really, I'll give you the function of the office basically responds to the Secretary of Defense, and so different secretaries, based upon their needs, have used it in different ways over the years. I don't want to put you on the spot, Jim, but so now that Mr. Marshall's retired, what's the function of the Office of Net Assessment? What's the future?
Sure. So, who asked questions, just so I can put a face with the name? Yeah. So, the Secretary Carter, actually has given us different guidance that lays out what it is he expects from the office. It's unclassified. It's probably posted on the website somewhere, probably. And he articulates 5 or 6 very specific things that he expects the office to do, all of which are very much in keeping with the historical direction that's been laid out by our 2 guests. So I think that shows 2 things. One, it shows that Secretary Carter, a long-time denizen of the Pentagon, understands the value of the function. And second, whenever you have a transition between leadership and an organization, continuity is of the essence. So I actually expect more of the same rather than more of different.
Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between Andy Marshall and Harold Brown, Secretary Brown, and why it was apparently so successful? And what exactly do you think that Andrew Marshall, how he affected Brown's thinking?
Do you want to take that, Barry?
Looking back over Andy's tenure net assessment, if I was going to finger the Secretary of Defense, who I think understood what net assessment was all about, perhaps more than any of the other secretaries, it would probably be Harold Brown. We did an interview with him in 2007, and it was, the way he put it was things that would come to him, studies, reports, decision memorandum, and things like that from all the rest of the Pentagon. Generally, we're trying to get him to make a choice. We've got options A, B, and C, and he should obviously pick B because that's the one we support. Andy, in his view, didn't have an agenda. He was trying to do diagnostic net assessment, and as Andrew said, not recommend, but simply evaluate what the situation was in a particular competition. And Secretary Brown really understood that and appreciated it, and talked about how different the things he got from Andy were from just about anywhere else in the Pentagon. So it was, I think Harold's insight and understanding of what the enterprise was all about.
There was, I think, between Schlesinger and Brown, it really was a period where I think the office was very much in sync with the defense secretary. Rumsfeld used to hold these meetings on Saturday mornings, and that assessment was there, and PAD, now CAPE, was there. And they brief on different topics. And there was one situation where they came in and PAD was briefing again on the kind of do we want this many ships of this type or that many ships of that type? And, Marshall and Rumsfeld, surprise, surprise, got impatient, said, let's stop looking at our shoelaces and try and get a sense of the big picture. And it was around the time that the offset strategy was coming into being. And Marshall and Jim Roach, who was in the office at the time, goes on to be Secretary of the Air Force, basically make the argument that, when you look at the maritime competition, the key business to be in, one of the key ones is undersea warfare. And we need to dominate in that area, and they gave a series of reasons why, and that they thought we could dominate, not only is important, but we could dominate for quite a period because of our growing advantage in information technologies, quieting, acoustics, and so on. And make a very good case. And if you're the Secretary of Defense, those are the kinds of insights you need, as opposed to, do we buy 8 submarines or 10 submarines?
And that interestingly enough, is an area, anti-submarine warfare. Andrew rightly said there's still a lot of this story to be revealed, as some of the more classified documents that the Pentagon Library now possesses become unclassified over time. And the whole issue of the ASW balance that Jim Roach wrote back in that period was so highly classified that when Bill Perry, who was, I think, DDR&E at the time, asked to look at the balance, he was told by the Navy that he could not. So there are a lot of shoes hidden back in the 5-drawer balance safe and the other documents that still haven't been declassified.
I think we have time for one more. There's a, yes, ma'am?
Could you talk a little bit about the evolution process for topic selection?
The original topics were chosen. Marshall comes over in October 1973. Schlesinger is now Defense Secretary. And they've been working at RAND since the early 1960s. So they're not only intellectual colleagues, they're personal friends. And they've already done, I think, the Vulcan mind meld or whatever over the course of that time. And they decide fairly on that they're going to do, typically the balances were either regional balances, so you'd be looking at NATO Warsaw Pact Central Front, a particular region, or a functional balance like the nuclear balance, the balance of nuclear forces between the two countries. And so they decide on several balances. One is the NATO Warsaw Pact, one is the nuclear. A third is the what they call the power projection balance, to try and capture other aspects of the military competition. And then they add on the investment balance. Did I miss any?
No, those are the ones.
Yeah.
It was a maritime balance that was really interpreted or understood by Schlesinger as power projection.
And then,
Now, I mean, one other thing I might just add, back in '70, when Andy was on the NSC, he was asked to do an overall assessment of U.S.-Soviet military competition. And one of the things that came out of that was the realization that you had to break, you couldn't just do the whole thing in one fell swoop. You had to break it into, if you will, sort of bite-sized parts, like the because if you think about the kinds of metrics that would be important in evaluating, say, strategic nuclear forces, those would not be the same ones you'd focus on if you were looking at the regional balance in Central Europe. So that, and as Andy rightly said, I don't think there was hardly any discussion between Schlesinger and Marshall in October 73 or the next month or two about those choices. They just seemed natural, logical. There was an internal logic behind them, which was, you know, if you wanted to deter them at the strategic nuclear level, and you thought maybe a war in Central Europe was the most likely scenario that might unfold conventionally and then lead to nuclear escalation. There was a logic between those two balances. And of course, power projection gets you into the maritime one. And the investment balance originally was sort of an attempt to see what the two sides were spending on, you know, where they were really putting their RDT&E and their investment money to get a sense of what the forces might look like in another 5 or 8 years.
But there, in the late 1970s, it's clear that the Soviets are talking about radio electronic combat and the use of jamming and you know, C4ISR and challenging it and so on. And there's an effort then to begin to take a look at that. In the 1980s, from time to time, there's the Korean balance is looked at. There was a short look at the northern balance, the ability of the Soviets to take Norway and outflank NATO and compromise logistics, and so looking at a bit of that balance. In the 1990s into the 2000s, the office made several unsuccessful runs at trying to get a sense of how would you do a sort of an information cyber kind of balance. And you know, there were many attempts at balances that were done that just never met Marshall standards and just never saw the light of day, never got forwarded to the defense secretary. And that was the case you know, with respect to those. So it was, it really was a case of where not only we were here to inform, not to please, but we're not going to send anything forward that, you know, really doesn't meet the standards necessary for providing quality advice to the Secretary of Defense.
Particularly as a military officer, working for Andy could be very frustrating because there were people, close personal friends of mine, who served 4 years in the office and never managed to get their balance out onto the Secretary of Defense. And for mission-oriented military guys, I mean, that was just enough to make you pull your hair out. But Andy was, yeah, we have. But, you know, Andy was very scrupulous on not sending balances forward until they were really, they identified some key issues for the Secretary of Defense.
Unfortunately, we've come upon the hour, but I would ask you to join me in a round of applause for our very Thank you for your very incisive and delightful talk.
Thank you.